The ready room at Odembert was heavy with cigarette smoke and the smell of wet wool. November rain drummed faintly against the tin roof, sliding in thin rivulets down the windows. Inside, the pilots of Jagdgeschwader 26 lounged in their leather jackets, laughing as a young lieutenant scrawled on the blackboard. With quick strokes of chalk, he outlined the squat nose and squared-off wings of an American bomber recently encountered over France. The silhouette was unmistakable. Boeing's B-17, the so-called Flying Fortress. The lieutenant tapped his chalk at the plexiglass nose, exaggerating its emptiness. "Here," he declared, "is where you aim. No guns, no protection. A fortress with the gate wide open." The room erupted in laughter, echoing off the bare walls. To men seasoned by combat over Poland, France, and Russia, the idea that this lumbering machine could dominate the skies seemed absurd. They had already proven the point in combat. In November 1942, German squadrons discovered that a massed frontal attack shredded the fortress before its gunners could react. 6 bombers fell in one day's fighting. Cameras mounted on Messerschmitt Bf-109s captured the spectacle. Shells bursting through noses, crews collapsing at their stations. Berlin's newsreels turned the footage into propaganda, christening the B-17 Fliegende Sarg, the flying coffin. For the Luftwaffe, the bomber presented no existential threat in 1942. The Americans had only begun to arrive in force, a few groups scattered across East Anglia. Their formations were small, their escorts limited, their crews green. Precision daylight bombing was mocked as a naive dream. Even the British, veterans of the Blitz, doubted the doctrine. To German eyes, the fortress was little more than a nuisance, easily broken apart by skillful pilots. Yet not all the laughter was carefree. A handful of officers noticed something troubling. Each week, more B-17s appeared over the Channel. New airfields sprang up in England with astonishing speed. Concrete runways poured across farmland, control towers rising overnight. The Americans were building infrastructure on a scale the Reich had never contemplated. Where Germany measured squadrons in dozens, America seemed to think in hundreds. One officer muttered after a raid, "The Americans are not like the British. They bring industry with them." Still, tradition shaped German confidence. The Luftwaffe had always prided itself on the individual skill of its pilots, the knightly ace who could outfly any opponent. They believed will and training outweighed numbers. The Reich's military culture celebrated scarcity turned into superiority, believing that technical finesse and daring could triumph over mass production. So the chalk squeaked across the board, and the laughter returned, masking the first shadows of doubt. The irony was cruel. Within 2 years, those same pilots would look up to see the sky carved with thousands of contrails. The B-17s would arrive not in fragile clusters, but in armadas, box formation stretching horizon to horizon, bristling with guns from every angle. The once vulnerable nose would sprout a Bendix chin turret, spitting .50 caliber fire into oncoming fighters. And above them, the long-range P-51 Mustang would sweep down, hunting the hunters. German aces, once confident in their tactics, would find themselves outnumbered, outgunned, and outproduced in every measurable way. But in November 1942, none of that had yet come to pass. In the ready room, laughter filled the air, carried on smoke and arrogance. The rain outside drummed its rhythm, indifferent to the confidence of men who believed they had solved the problem of the flying fortress. They did not know that the fortress they mocked was less a single aircraft than a symbol of something far larger, the awakening of an industrial democracy capable of flooding the skies with steel and fire until no city in Germany was safe. The morning of August 17, 1943 began clear and cool across East Anglia. At airfields scattered through the English countryside, ground crews tightened final bolts and fueled aircraft under the rising sun. In the dispersal huts, young Americans, some barely out of high school, strapped on flak jackets, adjusted oxygen masks, and filed silently toward their planes. This was no ordinary raid. Their orders were to strike deeper into Germany than ever before, hitting the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and the Messerschmitt works at Regensburg. Without ball bearings, the German war machine would grind to a halt. That was the theory. Lieutenant Jack Harriman sat hunched in the plexiglass nose of his B-17F, one of 376 flying fortresses that lumbered into the sky that morning. 4 Wright Cyclone R-1820 engines on each aircraft roared as the great fleet clawed for altitude, contrails streaking across the heavens until the formation resembled an airborne city. From the ground, English farmers looked up in awe. Nothing like it had ever been seen before. The mission was bold, almost reckless. 2 massive bomber streams launched on staggered routes, designed to split German defenses. But the Luftwaffe was waiting. As the fortresses crossed the Channel, radar screens in occupied Europe lit up with blips. Controllers vectored squadrons of Bf-109S and FW-190S into position. They knew the weak point well, the nose. German fighters screamed in from 12 o'clock high, firing 20-millimeter cannon shells straight into the bombers' faces. Harriman braced as shards of plexiglass sliced across his cheek. His bombardier slumped over, blood darkening his flight suit. Still, the formation held course. In a B-17, the rule was ironclad. Stay in the box, no matter what. A lone fortress was a dead fortress. Hours later, through bursts of flak and smoke, Harriman steadied the Norden bomb site over Schweinfurt. He toggled the release, and 6,000 pounds of bombs tumbled away, the aircraft lurching upward from sudden lightness. Behind him, other fortresses unloaded on Regensburg, hammering the Messerschmitt factories. On the ground, explosions rippled across machine shops and assembly lines, shattering glass and tearing roofs from their frames. But the cost was staggering. Of the 376 bombers launched, 60 never returned, nearly 1 in 6. More than 600 men were killed, captured, or missing in a single day. Survivors limped back to England, engines feathered, fuselages stitched with holes, fuel streaming from punctured tanks. At debriefings, crews reported entire sections annihilated, bomber boxes torn apart in midair. Chaplains walked silently through the huts that night, reading lists of the missing while the smell of burned hydraulic fluid and scorched paint clung to the air. German newsreels seized on the images. Propagandists called the raid the slaughter of the flying coffins. They showed wreckage scattered across Bavarian fields, tails jutting like crucifixes from blackened soil. To the Reich, it seemed confirmation that American daylight bombing was madness, a doctrine doomed to bleed itself white. The factories at Schweinfurt and Regensburg were damaged, yes, but not destroyed. Production slowed briefly before resuming. To German commanders, the lesson was clear. Skill and determination could still overcome mass. Yet what they missed was the deeper arithmetic. In losing 60 bombers, the Americans had paid dearly, but Boeing, Douglas, and Vega were already replacing them. In 1943 alone, American factories built over 4,000 B-17s. Losses that would have crippled Germany for months could be replenished in weeks. The Luftwaffe had no such luxury. Every German pilot shot down was a veteran years in the making, while every American loss was met with a fresh crewman trained in stateside schools where production lines for men matched those for machines. When Harriman's battered fortress touched down at his East Anglia base, one wheel blown, oil spraying across the runway, the ground crews swarmed it as though nothing unusual had happened. They counted bullet holes, patched the aluminum skin, and logged the missing crew. By morning, the aircraft would be patched and ready again. The men were not so easily replaced, but still the bombers would fly. Schweinfurt was not a victory in any tactical sense. but it marked something larger. The Americans would not stop, no matter the losses. The Germans still laughed, but the sound was thinner now, echoing against statistics that pointed to an uncomfortable truth. America could lose 60 fortresses and keep coming. Germany could not. The war room in London was never truly dark. Even at midnight, lamps glowed dimly over the great maps tacked to the walls, their surfaces crowded with colored pins marking targets across occupied Europe. Cigarette smoke hung low, curling in the air like the contrails that now stitched the skies over France. On one late evening in 1942, Brigadier General Ira Eaker, commander of the 8th Air Force, leaned across a table toward Winston Churchill and made his case with quiet conviction. "If the RAF continues night bombing and we bomb by day," he told the Prime Minister, "we shall bomb them round the clock, and the devil shall get no rest." It was more than a clever phrase. It was the heart of a doctrine that divided the Allies and, in time, would shatter the Reich. The Royal Air Force had learned the hard way that daylight raids were suicide. After catastrophic losses in 1939 and 1940, the RAF shifted to night bombing, adopting area attacks that targeted entire industrial districts rather than precise factories. Their Lancasters and Halifaxes relied on pathfinders and flares, burning out cities like Cologne and Essen under cover of darkness. For Britain, the doctrine was survival. The Americans disagreed. They clung to the belief that the Norden bomb site, combined with disciplined formations, could allow precision daylight bombing of specific targets: ball-bearing plants, oil refineries, rail yards. Losses would be higher, yes, but the payoff would be crippling Germany's war machine in ways indiscriminate destruction could not. Eaker was determined to prove that his citizen airmen, many of whom had been mechanics, clerks, or students only months before, could execute the most dangerous mission of the war. The British doubted him. After Schweinfurt, when 60 fortresses fell in flames, even sympathetic RAF officers shook their heads. "You can't keep bleeding like this," one told an American colonel. "The arithmetic won't hold." Yet the Americans persisted. They built their doctrine on more than bravery. It rested on the steel sinews of an industrial democracy. Every month, more groups arrived from the States, their airfields rising overnight from quiet English farmland. Long concrete runways scarred the landscape, and dispersal huts spread like villages around them. At the height of the buildup, an American airfield was completed in England every 3 days. From above, the formations resembled flying cities. Tight combat boxes stacked layer upon layer, each bomber's 50 caliber guns overlapping to form interlocking fields of fire. A lone fortress was meat for German fighters, but a box of 20 could throw up walls of tracers in every direction. Pilots learned the hard lesson: never break formation, never turn aside to evade. Survival lay in collective discipline. By late 1943, the promise Eaker had made to Churchill began to take shape. Hamburg, leveled in July by the combined weight of RAF incendiaries at night and B-17s by day, was proof of concept. Germany discovered that its cities no longer had a safe hour. If the sirens did not wail at midnight, they would scream at noon. Luftwaffe pilots who scrambled at night against Lancasters were called again by day against fortresses. Fatigue spread through units, morale eroded, and the strain began to show. The statistics, even then, were staggering. By year's end, the Americans had dropped over 60,000 tons of bombs on occupied Europe. The RAF added even more at night. Together, the Allies were delivering destruction at a scale Germany had never inflicted in all its years of Blitz. What the Luftwaffe failed to grasp was that this was only the beginning. American factories had only just begun to reach their stride. Churchill puffed his cigar, the glow briefly illuminating his tired face as he weighed Eaker's words that night. "Round the clock," he murmured. The phrase was adopted, repeated, and soon it was more than a slogan. It was the rhythm of annihilation, a heartbeat of engines that would not stop until Germany lay broken. The air over Hamburg on July 27, 1943, was unnaturally still. Summer heat pressed down, trapping the city in a haze of coal smoke and dust. In the canals, water glistened darkly, carrying the faint odor of oil and tar. 19-year-old Hannelore Brandt, a Red Cross nurse, stood in the doorway of a shelter and smelled something sharper, pitch burning somewhere in the distance. Then she heard it, the low, steady drone of engines. The sirens screamed and the sky lit with searchlights. At first came the Royal Air Force, Lancasters in waves, their bays heavy with incendiaries. They marked the targets with flares, and soon the city erupted in flames. Roofs collapsed as high explosives split open streets and factories. Hours later, as survivors crawled from the rubble to gasp for air, the sound returned. This time, it was deeper, slower, a different note in the sky. The B-17 flying fortresses of the United States 8th Air Force. The round-the-clock promise was no longer theory. Operation Gomorrah had begun. Over 7 days, the RAF and the USAF dropped nearly 9,000 tons of bombs on Hamburg. The result was more than destruction. It was transformation. The mixture of drought-dried timber, shattering high explosives, and cascades of incendiaries created a phenomenon no planner fully anticipated: a firestorm. Winds rose inside the city to hurricane force, flames feeding on themselves until they pulled oxygen from entire neighborhoods. Witnesses spoke of people dragged from shelters by the vacuum, their bodies hurled into the inferno. Concrete bunkers grew so hot that air itself seared lungs. In some districts, asphalt streets melted, fusing bodies into the surface. Police reports, written in stunned language, described the howling of the firestorm, the cries and moans of the dying. The numbers defied imagination: more than 34,000 dead, nearly 500,000 homeless. In 1 week, Hamburg had suffered greater devastation than London had endured in the entire Blitz. For the Luftwaffe, the psychological shock was immense. Defenses that had seemed formidable collapsed under sheer weight. British window, thin strips of foil dropped to confuse radar, rendered flak guns nearly blind. Fighters scrambled into smoke-choked skies, their pilots disoriented, their fuel wasted in futile pursuit. The Americans arrived by daylight, hammering shipyards and industrial plants with Norden-guided precision. For the first time, the Reich saw what round-the-clock bombing truly meant. There would be no hour safe from destruction. The impossible statistic lay bare in the wreckage. In a single week, Anglo-American air forces inflicted more damage on one city than Germany had managed in years of attacks on Britain. What the Reich had failed to do with the full weight of the Luftwaffe, the Allies accomplished with only a fraction of their growing strength. For Hannelore, crouched in a cellar with neighbors, statistics meant little. She felt the heat seeping through stone walls, heard timbers crack and collapse, listened to the desperate pounding of fists on doors already engulfed by flame. When she emerged days later, she walked streets lined with charred ruins. The canals were clogged with debris, the air thick with the sickly sweet stench of burned flesh. She remembered the newsreels that mocked the flying fortress, the laughter of announcers calling them coffins. Now she saw the truth. The fortresses were not jokes, but engines of ruin that would keep coming until nothing remained. For Germany, Hamburg was revelation. The Allies had discovered a weapon more devastating than any artillery barrage or tank assault: the systematic destruction of entire cities from the air. The firestorm silenced the laughter that had echoed in ready rooms less than a year before. From this moment on, the Reich understood that the fortress was not simply an aircraft. It was the herald of annihilation. In Wichita, Kansas, the winter of 1943 carried the constant hum of machinery. Boeing's factories never slept. Riveters hammered through the night. Sparks flashed from welding torches, and the smell of hot aluminum and oil filled the cavernous assembly halls. On the line stood the newest answer to German laughter, the B-17G, bristling with 13.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, including the crucial addition that changed everything, the Bendix chin turret beneath its plexiglass nose. The modification looked almost like an afterthought, a blister of metal and glass jutting below the cockpit. But for crews who had endured frontal attacks by BF-109S and FW-19OS, it was salvation. The Luftwaffe had discovered in late 1942 that the B-17F's nose was weak, unprotected by guns. They developed coordinated head-on attacks, diving through the bomber streams in formation, raking noses with cannon shells. Dozens of fortresses were torn apart before their gunners could even respond. Losses at Schweinfurt had proven the tactic devastating. American engineers listened. Reports from Europe reached Kansas within weeks, and designers went to work. The Bendix turret, already tested on other aircraft, was adapted for the Fortress. Operated by a gunner crouched at his controls, the turret could traverse rapidly, firing twin .50 caliber guns that hurled heavy slugs at more than 800 rounds per minute. Now, when German fighters charged in from 12 o'clock, they met a storm of fire. It was not the only change. The B-17G's waist positions were staggered so gunners would not collide in cramped quarters. The tailgun mount was redesigned into a more effective Cheyenne turret with greater visibility. Armor plating was reinforced around critical systems. Each new Fortress weighed more than its predecessor, yet the 4 Wright Cyclone engines still hauled it into the thin air at 30,000 feet. Its service ceiling remained over 6 miles, its range nearly 2,000 miles, its bomb load 6,000 pounds standard. Numbers like that were not just technical details, they were poetry in steel, proof that engineering and industry could respond faster than the enemy could adapt. For the Luftwaffe, the shift was jarring. Pilots who once laughed at the open gate in the Fortress now flew into curtains of fire. Losses mounted as bomber boxes bristled with guns from every angle. A head-on pass that once promised easy kills became a gauntlet few wished to run twice. Tactics shifted, then faltered. The Luftwaffe's advantage narrowed with every new B-17G that rolled from Wichita or Seattle. On the line, workers understood their part in the war. Many had brothers, husbands, or sons flying overseas. Rosie the Riveter was no myth. Women made up nearly half the workforce. They drilled, bolted, riveted, and signed their names on bomb bay doors in grease pencil. For Berlin, give 'em hell. In 1943 alone, over 4,000 Fortresses were produced. By 1944, America was building planes faster than Germany could shoot them down. One factory in Seattle turned out a completed B-17 every 90 minutes. For Germans who had once mocked the Fortress, this was the impossible statistic. In a single day, America could replace more bombers than an entire Jägerschwader might destroy in combat. The men in the air noticed the difference immediately. Crews flying the G model spoke of newfound confidence. A nose gunner could finally stare down a charging 109 and fire first. Morale ticked upward, though no one pretended the missions were safe. Loss rates still hovered near 20% on deep raids. But now at least, the Fortresses were evolving faster than the Luftwaffe could counter them. At bases in East Anglia, Harriman and his fellow crews climbed into their new machines, their noses armed and ready. In German ready rooms, the chalkboard jokes about the open gate faded into silence. The Fortress had found its teeth. The radar screens at Döberitz flickered in the gray light of early 1944. Green blips crawled across the scopes, at first in small clusters, then in waves too dense to count. Unteroffizier Karl Drexler, a Luftwaffe radio operator, leaned forward and adjusted the dials, hoping the machine was malfunctioning. But it wasn't. The formations were real, stretching across the channel, rolling inland with the slow inevitability of a tide. He rubbed his tired eyes and whispered to himself, so veal, so many. From Berlin's command centers, reports streamed in, bomber boxes of B-17 stacked at multiple altitudes, each contrail marking another column in the sky. The German defense system, radar stations, flak belts, fighter bases, had been designed to blunt sharp thrusts, not to absorb entire armadas. Yet here they came, hundreds of fortresses, wings glittering in the morning sun, each carrying 6,000 pounds of destruction. The Luftwaffe scrambled its fighters. Jagdgeschwader units took to the air in waves, Bf-109S and FW-190S clawing for altitude. Pilots squinted into the light, searching for openings in the formations. Once they had trusted in the frontal assault, diving headlong through the bomber streams. Now, with the B-17G's chin turret spitting fire, the tactic felt suicidal. Veterans muttered about dwindling odds. Young pilots, barely trained, struggled to hold formation as they hurtled into walls of tracers. Drexler listened to the radio chatter as voices overlapped in chaos. Shouts of contact, screams cut off by static, desperate calls for fuel and bearings. Controllers tried to vector squadrons into position, but the sheer number of bombers fractured the defense. Every time one wing peeled away, another appeared behind it, and then another. The Reich had once laughed at the fortress. Now it seemed to breed in the sky, multiplying faster than the Luftwaffe could kill them. On the ground, civilians craned their necks and saw the impossible. Contrails stretched across the heavens like white rivers, lines that never ended. Housewives whispered in disbelief, counting until their voices faltered. Children pointed at the sky, their faces pale with fear. For the first time, ordinary Germans understood that the war in the air was no longer a contest. It was an avalanche. The numbers confirmed what the eye already knew. By early 1944, the 8th Air Force could put up raids of 800 to 1,000 bombers in a single day. Each fortress carried a crew of 10, which meant 10,000 men in the air at once, supported by hundreds of escorts. The Luftwaffe could not match those figures. Its frontline fighter strength rarely exceeded a few hundred aircraft on any given day, many flown by green replacements with only a handful of hours in combat. Losses among veterans mounted. In January alone, the Luftwaffe lost nearly 1,000 fighters. In his ready room after the raid, Drexler scribbled in his logbook. He described the sight of formations so vast they seemed to blot out the sun, and the frustration of scrambling everything his unit had, only to feel powerless. For years, the Reich had relied on daring and skill, believing scarcity could be overcome by discipline. But scarcity has limits. No amount of courage could replace lost fuel, destroyed factories, or dead pilots. At East Anglia's airfields, the bombers returned one by one, some trailing smoke, others limping on 3 engines, but enough to prove the point. Ground crews counted the survivors and patched the wounded fortresses. Losses were noted, replacements already en route from American factories. For the Germans who had tracked the raid, the impossible statistic was undeniable. America could launch more bombers in one day than the Reich could destroy in a week. When Drexler looked at the sky that evening, the contrails had faded, but he still saw them in his mind. Endless lines across the heavens, signatures of an enemy whose strength seemed inexhaustible. "Es ist vorbei," he murmured. "It is over." On the morning of February 20th, 1944, East Anglia awoke to the sound of engines. At airfields from Norfolk to Suffolk, thousands of ground crewmen moved like ants across frozen runways. Breath steamed in the air as mechanics checked fuel lines, loaded bombs, and armed the Browning .50s in turrets. Inside briefing huts, crews drank bitter coffee from tin mugs and listened to the target list: Leipzig, Brunswick, Gotha, Regensburg. The mission was clear: cripple Germany's aircraft industry. They called it Operation Argument. History would remember it as Big Week. For Lieutenant Jack Harriman, now a veteran of multiple missions, the words carried a weight he could feel in his bones. Everyone knew this was no single raid, but a campaign, a deliberate hammering of the Luftwaffe until it broke. Over 5 days, the 8th Air Force and its Mediterranean counterpart, the 15th, would launch more than 3,000 bomber sorties. Nearly 10,000 tons of bombs would fall on factories producing Messerschmitts, Focke-Wulfs, and Junkers. It was not just about wrecking assembly lines, it was about forcing the Luftwaffe into the air, bleeding its fighter strength where replacements could not be made. The sky over Germany became a cauldron. Bf-109S and FW-190S hurled themselves into the formations, cannon fire ripping through aluminum. But the fortresses no longer flew alone. Slender P-51 Mustangs swept across the horizon, diving on German fighters with long-range fury. For the first time, the Americans had escorts that could follow them all the way to Berlin and back. The Luftwaffe found itself caught between two predators: the bombers' defensive walls of fire and the Mustangs' lethal agility. From Berlin, Albert Speer read reports with growing dread. The numbers told a story his Führer did not want to hear. In 1 week, the Luftwaffe lost roughly a third of its fighters and nearly a fifth of its veteran pilots. Factories were damaged, yes, but far worse was the hemorrhaging of trained men. A fighter could be built in weeks. A pilot required years. Germany did not have years left. The Americans paid in blood, too. 97 bombers were lost in the opening days, their crews swallowed by flak and fighters. But in East Anglia, replacements were already being assembled. Boeing and Douglas lines in the United States rolled out fortresses at such speed that a day's losses could be replenished in less than a week. The arithmetic favored America in ways the Luftwaffe could not match. Harriman's fortress returned with flak holes in the wings and 2 engines coughing black smoke. He and his crew staggered from the plane, exhausted, shaken, but alive. Around him, others did not return. Empty hardstands stood as silent markers, their absence noted on the operations board. Yet the mission continued. Tomorrow, another target. The day after, another. Big Week was not a single blow, but a relentless pounding, day after day, until the Luftwaffe's backbone snapped. The impossible statistic emerged by the campaign's end. In just 6 days, Germany had lost more aircraft than it could build in 2 months, and more pilots than it could train in a year. For the Americans, it was tragedy, but also triumph. They had found the breaking point of an enemy once thought invincible in the air. In Berlin, Speer confided to colleagues that the war's outcome was now visible in the balance sheets of production and loss. In England, Harriman read the names of friends on casualty lists and then climbed back into his patched fortress for the next mission. Courage carried him forward, but it was industry that ensured there would always be another bomber, another crew, another sortie. Big Week proved the truth that Germany had mocked in 1942. The Flying Fortress was not one plane, but a symbol of an inexhaustible nation. The morning of March 4th, 1944, dawned gray and cold, with low clouds drifting over the German capital. In his bunker-turned-operations center, Hermann Göring puffed at a cigarette and tried to sound confident, but his staff could see the nervous flicker in his eyes. Word had come that American bombers were inbound, again. But this raid was different. It would reach Berlin itself. Göring had once boasted that no enemy bomber would ever darken the skies above his city. That day, the boast would collapse in smoke and contrails. High above, the sound of engines rolled like distant thunder. The 8th Air Force had launched nearly 700 B-17s, escorted by a new breed of Guardian. Sleek, long-nosed P-51 Mustangs darted at the edges of the formations, their Rolls-Royce Merlin engines giving them range and speed no German fighter could match. For the first time, the bombers were not alone when they reached the Reich's heart. Unteroffizier Karl Drexler, now stationed near Berlin, watched the sky fill with impossible lines of white. Contrails stretched horizon to horizon, layered in altitude until the heavens themselves seemed painted by America. He tracked them on his radar screen, the blips overlapping in dense swarms. "Zu viele," he muttered. "Too many." German fighters scrambled in desperate waves. Bf-109S and FW-190S clawed into the formations, cannon shells bursting against bomber skins. But every time they dove, Mustangs dropped on them like hawks, guns chattering, contrails twisting into dogfights that spiraled toward the earth. Veteran Luftwaffe pilots, once predators, now found themselves prey. Some fought with suicidal courage. Others broke off rather than charge into walls of .50 caliber fire and Mustang squadrons waiting above. The raid pummeled Berlin with more than 2,000 tons of bombs. Industrial districts shook under the impact. Rail yards and factories erupted in fireballs, sending black smoke boiling into the clouds. Civilians huddled in shelters as the ground trembled, their faith in Göring's promises finally shattered. One survivor later recalled the sight. It was as if the whole sky was full of silver birds, endless, unending, and we knew then we could not fight them all. At his headquarters, Göring heard the first-hand reports and, in one of his rare moments of candor, admitted defeat. "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin," he later said, "I knew the war was lost." It was not just a remark. It was the recognition of a strategic collapse. The Luftwaffe could no longer defend the Reich's capital in daylight. The numbers told the story mercilessly. In March 1944 alone, the Luftwaffe lost nearly 1,000 fighters. American losses were heavy but sustainable: 40, sometimes 50 bombers in a day. Behind every destroyed fortress stood factories in Wichita and Seattle, where another rolled off the line every 90 minutes. Behind every lost pilot stood stateside training schools producing thousands more. The arithmetic was one-sided, and even Germany's best knew it. For Harriman, flying in formation that day, the sight was unforgettable. As his B-17 droned toward Berlin, he looked left and right and saw not dozens, but hundreds of fortresses in perfect formation. Above them, the Mustangs wheeled and dived, a protective shield that stretched all the way home. For the first time in months, he felt a flicker of belief that they might actually live to see victory. On the ground, Drexler returned to his radar station after the raid, his logbook heavy with lost tallies. He stared at the empty sky where the contrails had been and understood the truth his commanders still tried to deny. Germany could not fight numbers like these. The war was no longer about daring or skill. It was about production, endurance, and will. And in all three, the Reich was outmatched. In Detroit, the night shift never ended. The great factories of the arsenal of democracy pulsed with light, their smokestacks glowing red against the sky. Inside the Ford plant at Willow Run, a completed B-24 Liberator rolled off the line every 63 minutes. At Boeing's Seattle Works, B-17 Flying Fortresses emerged in endless rows, their olive-drab skins gleaming under floodlights. Douglas at Long Beach and Vega at Burbank matched the pace, their assembly halls echoing with the clatter of rivet guns and the hiss of welding torches. The United States had transformed its automobile industry into an aviation juggernaut. What had once produced Buicks and Packards now built bombers by the thousands. For America, production was more than numbers. It was strategy. In 1944 alone, American factories turned out 96,000 aircraft, more than the Luftwaffe possessed at any moment in the war. Boeing alone produced 12,731 B-17s by war's end. Germany, with its scattered workshops and bomb-shattered infrastructure, could not compete. The impossible statistic lay in this comparison. A single American plant outproduced the entire German fighter industry in some months. Back in Berlin, Albert Speer pored over reports with grim resignation. He saw the charts that showed American curves rising as German ones fell. Big Week had gutted the Luftwaffe's ability to defend the Reich, and now the bombers came in waves too vast to resist. Each month, Speer's staff reported new shortages: fuel, steel, aluminum. Production lines that had once promised advanced fighters like the Me-262 were paralyzed by bombing, cut rails, and power outages. Meanwhile, American industry flooded Europe not just with planes, but with the spare parts, fuel, and crews to keep them flying. On the line in Seattle, a woman named Ruth Cunningham tightened the bolts on a wing spar, wiping sweat with the back of her sleeve. Her husband was in Italy, flying a B-24, and she thought of him every time she set her torque wrench. She worked 10-hour shifts, 6 days a week, one of millions who transformed America's industrial base into a war-winning machine. The image of Rosie the Riveter was more than propaganda. It was reality. Tens of thousands of women keeping the lines humming while their husbands, brothers, and sons fought overseas. For the Germans, the contrast was crushing. A Jagdgeschwader might destroy 50 bombers in one brutal day, only to see twice that number roll into England the following week. Every loss that bled the 8th Air Force was quickly healed. Every loss the Luftwaffe suffered was permanent. A pilot with 500 combat hours could not be replaced by a boy with 50. Germany's faith in skill and scarcity collapsed under America's abundance. The skies reflected the arithmetic. By mid-1944, raids of 1,500 bombers became routine. Crews looked left and right and saw contrails stretching to the horizon, each fortress and liberator bristling with guns, each escorted by sleek Mustangs. German civilians craned their necks and whispered in disbelief. "How can there be so many?" one Berlin diarist wrote. "Where do they come from? And why do they never stop?" At East Anglia, Harriman watched the ground crews patch his bomber with new aluminum sheets after every raid. The smell of fuel and hot oil filled the dispersal bays as mechanics worked through the night. For every engine shredded by flak, another waited in crates. For every plane wrecked, another arrived on the next convoy. The system was unstoppable. The industrial tsunami was not simply about machines. It was about inevitability. America could afford mistakes, could absorb losses, could experiment and adapt because its factories guaranteed the flow would never cease. Germany could not. The Reich's laughter from 1942 had drowned beneath the roar of assembly lines that stretched across an ocean. On the night of February 13, 1945, the people of Dresden believed themselves safe. The Baroque city, with its spires and river bridges, had been spared the devastation visited upon Hamburg and Berlin. Refugees from the east crowded its streets, fleeing the Red Army's advance. The air smelled of coal smoke and wet stone, not yet of ruin. In shelters, civilians whispered that perhaps Dresden would survive the war untouched. Then the sirens wailed. At first came the Royal Air Force, nearly 800 Lancasters dropping a mixture of high explosives and incendiaries. They shattered roofs and blasted open timber frames, then rained down fire. Streets became rivers of flame. Hours later, just before dawn, the United States 8th Air Force arrived. Almost 400 B-17s thundered overhead, their bays opening in unison. 6,000 pounds of bombs per aircraft fell into the already burning city, the daylight complement to the night's destruction. For the first time, Dresden faced the full reality of round-the-clock bombing, and it would not survive. The firestorm consumed everything. Temperatures soared high enough to melt steel. Winds whipped through the streets at hurricane force, dragging people into the flames. Eyewitnesses spoke of oxygen sucked from shelters, suffocating entire families without a spark touching them. Victor Klemperer, a diarist who survived, wrote in horror, "Outside it was bright as day, the glow of death itself." By the time the raids ended, as many as 25,000 people were dead. Nearly 1,300 acres of the city lay in ruins. For the Germans, Dresden was more than tragedy. It was revelation. Even a city believed untouchable could vanish in less than 48 hours. The Reich had once laughed at the flying fortress, mocking its vulnerabilities. Now those same machines erased entire cultural centers in a matter of days. The name fortress no longer seemed absurd. It was grimly appropriate. From the American side, crews approached the mission with grim routine. Briefings listed the target as transportation and communications hubs, rail yards feeding German reinforcements to the Eastern Front. Pilots toggled the Norden bomb site and released their payloads with practiced precision. Many had flown 20, even 30 missions by then, hardened by Schweinfurt, Hamburg, Berlin. Dresden was another city, another set of coordinates. Yet as their bombs fell into a furnace already raging, some gunners turned their heads away from the glow. Even veterans struggled to comprehend the scale of destruction below. The statistics dwarfed imagination. In 37 hours, Allied bombers dropped nearly 4,000 tons of ordnance on Dresden. The firestorm it created killed more in 2 nights than the Luftwaffe had killed in months of the Blitz. Once again, the impossible comparison stood clear. What Germany had failed to accomplish over London in years, America and Britain achieved in days. For civilians like Hannelore Brandt, who had survived Hamburg, Dresden was a nightmare repeated. She remembered the smell, the howl of the fire, the blackened ruins stretching farther than the eye could see. She no longer laughed at propaganda or listened to Goering's promises. She knew the war was lost. The only question left was how many more cities would burn before the end. At East Anglia, Harriman's crew debriefed after the raid. The room was quiet, their faces gray with exhaustion. They had done their duty, dropped their bombs, and returned alive. But as one gunner whispered, "That city will never come back." For the men in the air, Dresden was another mission completed. For those on the ground, it was the end of a world. The Inferno marked a turning point, not in tactics, but in recognition. The laughter that had greeted the fortress in 1942 was now buried under ash and silence. The B-17 had fulfilled its grim purpose, not as a single machine, but as part of an industrial storm that left nothing untouched. By the spring of 1944, Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments, knew the truth his Führer refused to hear. He sat at a long oak table in the Reich Chancellery, reports spread before him in neat rows of figures. The columns told a story more brutal than any battlefield communique. Oil production plummeting, rail networks fractured, aircraft factories pulverized. Even before Dresden's flames, the war had already been lost, on paper, in arithmetic. Speer had once boasted of miracles, increasing production, despite Allied bombing. For a time, he succeeded. But after the raids of Big Week and the relentless assaults on transportation networks, miracles dried up. By August 1944, his reports recorded a steady decline in output. Synthetic fuel plants at Leuna and Politz lay in ruins. Rail junctions at Hamm and Cologne twisted into scrap, and repair crews could not keep pace. Without fuel, even the new jet fighters sat idle on runways. The Americans called it the transportation plan. With characteristic bluntness, they aimed not at armies, but at arteries, railroads, bridges, oil refineries. The 8th Air Force dropped thousands of tons on marshalling yards, while the 15th hammered synthetic fuel plants from Italy. German trains stood frozen on tracks, locomotives gutted, cars abandoned. Civilians rode bicycles past wrecked engines, their war effort reduced to muscle power. The numbers were merciless. By late 1944, Allied bombers were flying 3,000 sorties in a single day. Over the course of the campaign, the U.S. Army Air Forces alone flew 1.44 million sorties and dropped 2.7 million tons of bombs on Europe. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of Germany, had been ground to dust. Its operational fighter strength shrank from 2,000 aircraft in 1943 to barely 300 by the war's end, many flown by boys with only a handful of hours in the cockpit. Speer confessed years later at Nuremberg that he saw the inevitability by autumn 1944. From then on, he admitted, production declined steadily despite all my efforts. It was the recognition of a man who had built his career on efficiency, now forced to watch efficiency dissolve in smoke and rubble. He knew that every new plant rebuilt would be smashed again within weeks. Against America's industrial tide, ingenuity was meaningless. On the other side of the channel, 8th Air Force commanders read their own figures. Losses were still heavy, 26,000 dead by war's end, the costliest campaign for any American branch. But the arithmetic worked in their favor. Factories in Seattle and Detroit replaced bombers faster than Germany could shoot them down. Training schools in Texas and Arizona graduated new crews at a rate the Luftwaffe could not dream of matching. For every fortress lost, another rolled down a runway within days. Lieutenant Harriman, by now weathered and hollow-eyed, saw the arithmetic in human terms. Hard stands that had been empty after Schweinfurt were filled again within weeks. Missions grew larger, not smaller, despite losses. He buried friends, wrote letters home for the dead, and still climbed into a cockpit knowing another 10 men would take his place if he fell. It was grim comfort, but comfort all the same. The machine behind him would not stop. In Berlin, Speer delivered his reports in clipped tones, but the numbers needed no embellishment. The Reich's lifeblood, oil, transport, steel, was gone. Hitler still raged about miracles, but miracles had become mathematics, and mathematics favored America. The flying coffins the Reich had once mocked were now coffins for German industry itself. The war was no longer a contest of tactics or daring. It was a ledger, a balance sheet of production and destruction. And in that balance, the Reich was bankrupt. On a quiet hillside outside Cambridge, England, the grass is trimmed neatly around row upon row of white marble crosses. Each one bears a name, a rank, a date of death. Some simply read known unto God. Here lie 3,812 Americans who never returned from the skies above Europe. Their graves a fraction of the 26,000 airmen of the 8th Air Force who gave their lives. When the war ended, silence fell over airfields once alive with the roar of engines, but it was not the silence of peace alone. It was the silence of absence, of voices lost forever. For the men who flew, the cost had always been clear. Loss rates of 20% were not abstract figures. They were faces missing at the mess table, bunks left empty, flight jackets hung on pegs that would never again be worn. At briefing huts, chaplains offered prayers over crews who knew they might not live to see evening. Yet they strapped themselves into their fortresses, engines roaring, and lifted off into skies blackened with flak because they understood what was at stake. The irony was sharp. The Reich had once laughed at the flying fortress, calling it a coffin in the sky. But in the end, it was not the fortress that was buried. It was the laughter. Cities once proud of their invulnerability were reduced to ash. Hamburg, Berlin, Dresden, names now synonymous with firestorms. What Germany had mocked became the instrument of its undoing, and what America sacrificed became the price of Europe's liberation. The numbers remain almost impossible to grasp. Boeing built 12,731 B-17s during the war. Nearly 4,735 were lost in combat. Yet replacements came so fast that the formations never faltered. American industry poured out aircraft, engines, bombs, and fuel at rates the enemy could not dream of. In 1944, a single American factory produced more aircraft than all of Germany combined. In some months, Detroit made more trucks than the Wehrmacht had on its entire Eastern Front. These statistics are not just records. They are weapons, as decisive as any gun or bomb. But behind every number stood a human being. A waist gunner clutching a frozen .50 caliber, as frost bit his fingers at 30,000 feet. A pilot guiding a crippled fortress back across the channel with fuel leaking from shredded tanks. A bombardier peering through a Norden sight, steadying his hand even as flak peppered the plexiglass around him. Their courage gave meaning to the industrial storm behind them. Without their will to climb into those machines, all the factories in America would have been meaningless. Lieutenant Jack Harriman, if he lived to see the war's end, might have walked the rows at Cambridge and traced the names of those who hadn't. He would have understood, as many did, that victory was built not only on machines, but on sacrifice. The silence of the cemetery spoke louder than the laughter of 1942, louder even than the roar of engines over Berlin. In Germany, survivors like Hannelore Brandt emerged from ruins to rebuild their lives in a democracy shaped by the very enemy that had destroyed their cities. For her and millions like her, the silence after surrender was the first true silence they had known in years. No bombers, no sirens, no firestorms, only the hum of rebuilding, made possible by the same industrial might that had leveled her world. The flying fortress was never perfect. It was loud, vulnerable, and terrifying to fly into combat. But it was enough. Enough to shatter the Reich's illusions. Enough to prove that industrial democracy could outlast tyranny. Enough to remind the world that freedom's price is measured in both blood and steel. The Germans laughed in 1942. By 1945, the only sound left was silence, reverent, eternal, and paid for by the men who never came home.